Hi, everybody. I'm sorry to be a little late. I had some technical difficulties after I got off the Zoom call I was on. Took a little while to get my system straight again. But here we are. I'm only about 7 minutes late. I'm very glad to see those of you who hung in there waiting for me. I'm not going to share to too many places tonight. I'm going to leave it to you because I am a little bit late and I need to pick up some time. So I'll just share to one or two places and I'll be with you in a minute. Leave it up to you to share to groups. If you would, I'll appreciate that. I will share to my pages and leave it at that. So can everybody hear me all right? I hope so. Let me check my sound mixer. Looks like I might be good to go. Hang on. Oh, there's Amber. Hey, Amber, how are you? Nice to see you. Only about 7 minutes. Okay, that should cut off the echo. Hopefully, let me know if my sound's okay. There we are. I see Jeffrey Denton is here. Also, Dolores and Lana. Hi. And Kay. Steve Wolfbrandt, that is. And Amber, as I said before. Sherry Wise is here. Hi, Sherry. How are you? Dia Swift said, newbie here. I hear you well. You were recommended highly. Nice to be here. Thank you, Dia. I'm glad to know someone recommended me highly. Let me get my promo out of the way. So, oh wow, there are quite a few of you here, so I guess that's good. Thank you very much. I'm glad to see you. So tonight, what I want to talk about is, first of all, how things are looking in terms of the insurrection. I don't think the insurrection's over. Far from it, I think. So I want to go over some articles that talk about that. They come from a columnist named Juan Cole. And I like Juan very much. I've been reading him for years. He's usually very well informed. And he's certainly lefty, but he's also very concerned about things like violence, and insurrection, and things like that. Then I want to talk about what kinds of things can be done about the insurrection. And there were some good articles on that over at The Week, which I want to share with you and comment on. And then I also want to talk about the Democrats' false choice on impeachment, which comes from another article over at the Week, and I want to share and comment on that article as well. So this episode is going to be about the troubles we are having. And it looks like I was recommended by Lana because she said, hi, Dia. And Dia says, hello, Madame Dwayne. Hello, Madame Dell. Okay. Okay, so let me share the screen then for the first article. And we'll go over that. That's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda. This is from Informed Comment, which is Juan Cole's personal blog. He appears in Common Dreams as a columnist also quite frequently, and reader-supported news as well. But the first place his blogs appear is usually here. This one is called Vanilla ISIL. Social media is forced to treat Trump and Trumpists like terrorists. And this one was written on January 9th by Juan, so it's a few days old. And he's at the University of Michigan, so Ann Arbor is where his writings originate from. So it says that on your screen, okay, at this point. So not everyone who mobbed the Capitol on January 6th was a terrorist, but there were many terrorists among them. Some people came armed or with ties for taking congressional representatives and senators hostage. Some were desperately looking for Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi in order to assassinate them for, in their fevered minds, stealing the election and giving Trump's victory treacherously to Joe Biden. Although the Capitol Police had a major failure where they did not stop the breach of the building by the mob, they were remarkably successful at spiriting the politicians down to the basement and its tunnels that led to nearby offices. Otherwise, the sinister events of that day, in which one policeman was deliberately crushed to death by a mass crowd in a doorway, would have claimed many more lives. The goal of the Trump-inspired insurrection was to stop Congress from certifying the election of Joe Biden as president. Trump moved on several levels to accomplish that goal. So this is something you don't often see in other analyses, the idea that Trump moved deliberately on several levels to accomplish that goal of stopping Congress from actually certifying the election of Joe Biden. He conspired with senators to have them object to the Arizona and Pennsylvania vote counts. We know he did that. We know the senators he conspired with. In fact, Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, and probably Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee also, and a few others, and Ron Johnson, Wisconsin. In fact, he was trying to convince senators to join this effort by telephone even after the Capitol had been breached and senators were being escorted to the basement. So here are the senators, they're under physical attack, and he's trying to convince them to join this effort by telephone. Personally, if I were one of those senators, I would have told them to shove it where the sun don't shine. Anyway, this was even after the Capitol had been breached and senators were being escorted to the basement, according to Mike Lee. So he must have called Mike Lee, right? Or maybe he called somebody who was standing near Mike Lee. So he also tried to disrupt the proceedings by encouraging the breach of the Capitol by a flash mob and by cadres. Yeah, the flash mob having cadres that were leading the flash mob. Now, whether he planned it that way or not, I don't think is completely clear. He may have known exactly what was going on. He may simply have left it to his people. He may have stopped security forces from being deployed as part of his coup, to ensure that the insurrection was not stopped prematurely. It seems to me this may be more probable, that he understood there was going to be a flash mob led by cadres of basically black shirts that were going to riot on his behalf. But when the governor of Maryland sought authorization to send that state's National Guard, he was stonewalled for a crucial 90 minutes, during which Pence, Pelosi, and others could have been killed if they had been. It is not clear Biden's election could have been certified in a timely manner. It may be more clear, however, that the reaction of Congress would have become even stronger than it was. Trump spent December moving his ideologues into key positions at the Pentagon, likely hoping to use them to make sure the military could not be deployed at the Capitol. That is, the insurrection was in part a coup. Okay, at least an attempted coup. Terrorism was defined in the 1990s U.S. Federal Code as non-state actors deploying force against civilians to achieve a political goal. This is still a little too vague for me. It really all depends on what force is. I'm not sure about this definition quite. But anyway, the law has been tinkered with in light of Bush's war on terror, quote unquote. But I think the Clinton era definition has virtues for analysis since it is very clear. And I'm not sure it's very clear unless force is very clear. I personally think maybe violence is more clear, but okay. Only the state has a legitimate monopoly on the use of force in modern society. We used to like to say that only the state has a legitimate monopoly on the use of a physical coercion in modern society. That seems somehow more appropriate than force here. But anyway, according to Max Weber, terrorists are vigilantes. Internet terrorist networks, like the Trumpists, have posed a challenge to law enforcement for decades, and students of terrorism have learned a great deal about them and how to combat them. The internet is a communications medium, and terrorism is all about communication. ISIL was among the best at working social media and initially ran rings around the governments it targeted. Use of social media by designated terrorist groups has been a horrifying success, but the use of deplatforming, quote unquote, kicking large numbers of members off platforms such as Twitter or Facebook, has been among the most effective tools in reducing the influence and operational effectiveness of groups such as ISIL. As of Friday, the large social media platforms are treating Trump and the more virulent forms of Trumpism the way they did ISIL, deplatforming them. Trump has been banned from Twitter and Facebook. The far-right-wing Parler app has been kicked off Google Play and will likely be expelled from Apple apps. Yes, it has been expelled now, from Apple apps. It is off the App Store. The indicted fraudster, Steve Bannon, has lost his YouTube perch. The Trump insurgency used the internet at several levels, just as ISIL had done. Here I am talking about techniques of terrorist organizations, not comparing them for brutality. Obviously, ISIL is far more murderous by orders of magnitude. One, Twitter, Facebook, by YouTube, Alex Jones, Steve Bannon, The Breitbart blog and other platforms were used by Trump and his allies to build an audience for their white nationalist ideology. One of their first messages was that the Obama presidency was illegitimate because only white men can legitimately be president. This message was expressed through a conspiracy theory denying that Obama was born in the United States. Two, this messaging was expensive. Moreover, white supremacy of the old KKK sort was also disreputable. In order to succeed, a lot of money had to be thrown at the project, and white supremacy had to be put in a business suit, given Ivy League degrees, and made respectable. Hence the term, quote, the alt-right, unquote, a fancy word for neo-Nazi. The project was not centralized. It is not clear that that Robert Mercer, a computer engineer and artificial intelligence expert who came to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, ever knew Trump. His backing for Breitbart, however, turned a cranky little far right-wing blog into a major publication with millions of hits per day. Breitbart, in turn, heavily backed Trump in 2015. So too did other far-right news sites such as Newsmax. And of course, the media behemoth backed the new white supremacy was Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, with an ideology I suspect is rooted in the old 20th century white Australia policy. Now, Murdoch originates in Australia, of course. 3, this vast social and traditional media operation helped create a mass viewership for Trumpism, a constituency from which activists could be recruited. It also helped him make inroads into the Republican Party. Trumpism, however ugly, is not synonymous with terrorism or insurrection. In fact, very few terrorists fit the definition given above. Likewise, I have pointed out that very few Muslim fundamentalists were ever terrorists. Many were quietists. They avoided politics. Still, the Muslim terrorists emerged from fundamentalist backgrounds. Terrorism is a set of techniques for the attainment of a political goal. It's not an ideology. The father of Mohammed Amir Atta, the lead hijacker on 9/11, was an Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood member, an attorney in Giza. The father had apocalyptic dreams of social transformation, but never harmed a soul. The son helped murder nearly 3,000 innocents. It is from the perfervid true believers that the operatives are recruited. 4, the internet could thus be used to recruit small numbers of terrorists from the vast fascist network that Trump and others created, and to organize January 6th. White grievance was stoked with hatred of the minorities and immigrants. The network had mostly been used as a vote bank and for the purposes of propaganda, such as convincing people that Hillary Clinton ran a pedophile ring out of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. Hey, Steve Wolfbrandt. It was, however, always available for more specialized recruitment and missions. One phenomenon associated with social media organizing is the flash mob. A person could say, quote, everybody meet at the mall at 3 p.m. on Saturday the 11th, unquote. Sometimes it happens that such a suggestion is unexpectedly responded to by 5,000 teenagers and creates a security danger. January 6th was in part a flash mob. Seasoned observers of white supremacist terrorist networks on the internet saw it building. 6. Those willing to engage in terrorism in the capital could also use social media to communicate with one another, using code words to fly under the radar of law enforcement. In the zeros, Al-Qaeda used the code word technique. An operative might refer to an operation as a banquet and to a bombing as a very big meal. Number 7, aside from movement building, from terrorist recruitment and logistics, such as the creation of a flash mob, the internet can also be used for stochastic or random terrorism. Word can be put out to unconnected, random individuals that something must be done. Since these individuals are not part of organizations, they're typically not under surveillance by law enforcement and can act as lone wolves, taking the establishment by surprise, self-organizing on the spot, basically. The flash mob at the Capitol on January 6th was a mixture of social networks, people who knew each other face to face, the cadres, the internet networks, Facebook circles, and stochastic lone wolf terrorists. This mixture made the aims and techniques of the flash mob opaque, that is, opaque to law enforcement, opaque perhaps to the FBI, opaque perhaps to Homeland Security. ISIL had engaged in all these activities and used all these techniques ultimately to create a state and attempt to terrorize potential Western adversaries, such as France, into standing down. France was the former colonial power in Syria and Lebanon and takes a post-colonial interest in what happens there. ISIL activists were wizards at the production of slick video and the use of Twitter and Facebook for recruitment and operations. Once it became clear how successful ISIL was in using Twitter, for example, the company launched a campaign to deplatform the terrorist organization by canceling 125,000 accounts in 2016 alone. Deplatforming on a large scale is devastating, since when an account is closed, all of its tweets are deleted, and all the connections established to other accounts are lost. Some of the success law enforcement has had against ISIL has derived from deplatforming, though of course the military victories in Syria and Iraq against the organization were also important in demoting it from a phony caliphate, quote unquote, to a small transnational terrorist organization. For every successful counterterrorism technique in advance, however, terrorists have found ways to evade them. That is, counterterrorism is not the sort of endeavor where you can have a success and just keep doing things the same way. It is a contest in which the adversary constantly evolves. Even which groups are terrorist in character change over time, with previously nonviolent groups becoming violent and vice versa. Significant blows have been dealt to the Trump terrorist network in the past 2 days, but the vast well of support it has built up among less violent supporters and among the media enablers like Fox, Breitbart, and Newsmax will make it very difficult to root out, says one Cole. So let's go to another of Juan's pieces. This one from January 11th. Wednesday, January 6th was clearly an attempted coup on Trump's part. There's some controversy about this, depending on how analysts define a coup, quote unquote, was of course not a successful coup d'etat, inasmuch as it failed to overturn the government or even to permanently install an elected president as an emperor for life. But that it was an attempted coup seems to me clear. Yes, I agree. In fact, I made that comment on the earlier blog. Trump had a three-pronged strategy to overturn the election of Biden. Part one was a propaganda campaign maintaining he'd won the election, and it was stolen from him by irregularities in the swing states of Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia. In all those states, there were minorities coded by Trump and Trumpies as not real Americans, and they provided the margin of victory to Biden. The claim of electoral fraud was therefore, in part, a racist dog whistle. Trump spread around his propaganda that Biden actually lost with his vast and effective communications machine. He reached his 70 million myrmidons on Twitter directly and frequently. He gave televised speeches carried on mass media like CNN, in which he said he had won by a landslide. CNN tried to contextualize the lie, but video of a president speaking is more powerful than the tut-tutting of television reporters. You don't say. And the tut-tutting of alternative media, too, I'm afraid. The fascist media put in his service by the billionaires whose taxes he cut. Breitbart, Newsmax, Fox News, OAN, all cast doubt on Biden's legitimacy. Much of the Republican Party, state and national leadership adopted Trump's big lie, including House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and over 140 members of Congress. 140 members were all on the Republican side, by the way. Even non-crazy Republicans adopted the mantra of irregularities, as in Pennsylvania, questioning the ruling of that state Supreme Court. You can argue the Supreme Court made a bad ruling. You can't argue that its ruling is not the law of the land, but they did. They tried to argue that. The propaganda campaign was so successful that half of Republicans believed the big lie. Some 23 million people, nearly the population of all of Australia. It is a terrifying success that Trump could hypnotize a population the size of the fifth continent into fervently believing a rank falsehood without a shred of truth to it. Part two of the coup was to threaten, browbeat, and menace Republican officials in the four swing states into refusing to certify the Biden win. The two Republican canvassers for Wayne County in Michigan, specifically Monica Palmer and William Hartman, initially refused to certify the results in accordance with Trump's wish, threatening to hold up the declaration of Biden's win there. Only a massive public outcry made them back down. But back down they did, quickly. Actually, what they did was, they initially said they were going to certify it. Okay, and then they refused to certify it. And then they certify it. They certified it, right? After a massive public outcry. And then Trump called them again, and they said they want to decertify it, if you recall. That they made the wrong decision. They wanted to decertify it. But Michigan wouldn't let them take the certification back. Anyway, Trump then called Republicans from the Michigan state legislature to the White House for consultations, urging them to refuse to certify Biden. And he repeatedly called the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, and other officials in that state using organized crime code words to intimate that something bad would happen to them if they didn't, quote, find, unquote, the 11,000 some votes he needed to beat Biden. In fact, he even stated the exact number, wasn't it? 11,790? Because Biden was ahead by 11,789. It was something like that. It was hilarious. Raffensperger, to protect himself from any Trump retaliation, made and released a tape of the threatening conversation. Yeah, Raffensperger really outsmarted him. He recorded the whole thing and released it. When the Republican state officials and legislators defied Trump and certified Biden's election, Trump turned his attention to Congress. He worked the phones like a maniac, cajoling and threatening, shades of Lyndon Johnson. He menaced any senators or congressmen who refused to vote against certifying the state tallies in 4 swing states with being primaried. He told Kelly Loeffler, a Republican candidate for the Senate in Georgia, that he would, quote, do a number on her, unquote. What does that mean? If she didn't reject Biden's win in her state, Trump's scenario, I mean, this guy is like, he's like a mafia don. He's a hood. Trump's scenario appears to have been this. Enough Republicans in the House and Senate would reject the results of the 4 swing states to raise serious questions about a Biden win. Then Mike Pence, the president of the Senate, would use the substantial dissent about the result to cast doubt on the results. Trump crony Michael Flynn suggested that Trump at that point used the military to, quote, rerun the election, unquote, according to the New York Times. It became clear to Trump, however, that Pence would not play ball and that he could only count on 12 Republican senators to try to overturn Biden's election. Only 12? Only count on 12? 12 out of 53? More than 1/5 of the Republican senators? That's incredible. He needed some way of applying even more pressure or of sowing enough turmoil, to create an opening for some sort of decisive action on his part. Part 3 of the coup attempt was to put pressure on Congress to challenge the Biden win through a massive rally of the far right before the Capitol on January 6th. Trump called for the rally, came to address it in the late morning. Although he urged them to be peaceful, he did say, quote, we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, unquote. Trump had done a dry run for this mob action in Michigan when last spring Governor Whitmer imposed an economic lockdown to combat the rapid spread of the coronavirus. Trump tweeted out, quote, liberate Michigan, unquote, in response to an assemblage of white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, gun nuts, and restaurateurs showed up at the state capitol in Lansing. Guess what? They invaded the state house, and the lawmakers had to suspend their work that day. Trump's attack on Whitmer also had the effect of encouraging a far-right domestic terror cell to make a plan to kidnap and possibly kill her. I mean, that was like Looney Tunes. That was so far out. The plan to kidnap and possibly kill her was only foiled, of course, by the FBI. Thank God Trump didn't control the FBI. He appointed this guy Wray as the head of the FBI, but fortunately for all of us and for Gretchen Whitmer, he couldn't control Wray. With the Michigan example before him, it is impossible that Trump was aware that his dog whistles to the far right, his demonization of leaders who defied him, could produce violence. The mob of black shirts he assembled was intended to intimidate Pence, and the legislators, and to create chaos, of which he clearly thought he could take advantage. He used them to make clear to the Republican senators and representatives that the party faithful, the QAnon white supremacist mob, would not put up with anything else, and that not only their careers, but their very lives hung in the balance. Hence his glee when the Capitol was invaded. Yeah, the Capitol is invaded. This guy is watching it on television, laughing, unwilling to take calls from anybody. Just he's too busy watching it on television. And the elements of the mob are chanting, quote, hang Mike Pence, unquote. And others wanted to get Nancy Pelosi. Evidently, Pence thinks it's all a joke because today, I guess, he and Trump were buddying up again. How would you like to buddy up with someone who was gleeful about a mob chanting, hang you, a few days earlier? The politicians were in real danger, and it was only the efficiency of the Capitol Police in whisking them away to safe rooms or the basement that saved their lives. Had Pence or Pelosi been kidnapped, wounded, or killed, it would have halted the Biden certification process for some time, giving Trump the opportunity to find a way to remain in office. It is not that Trump himself urged or planned the breach of the Capitol or the infliction of harm. It is that he was attempting to create an unnamed chaos, which he viewed as advantageous to his efforts to remain in office. That has been Trump's whole pattern, always to act as an agent of chaos within the political system and then wait for opportunities that he could take advantage of as this agent of chaos. The unusual lightness of the police presence in D.C. really very clever as a strategy for insurrection, and then taking advantage of insurrection to try to take over as a dictator. In fact, I'm not sure he had Hitler on his nightstand. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. The guy he must have had on his nightstand was probably Mussolini. The unusual likeness, I'm kidding, of course. I have no reason to doubt he had Hitler on his nightstand if his wife said so, former wife. The unusual lightness of the police presence in D.C. compared to all the other demonstrations held in the past year raises questions about whether Trump's security officials were attempting to make sure the mob was not interfered with. Governor Larry Hogan said it took 90 minutes for the Pentagon to give him permission to send in the Maryland National Guard once he asked. This was at a time when thugs were roaming the Capitol, chanting, hang Mike Pence. And God, that was really something to hear. I don't know if you had a chance to hear the video or to watch the video of that and hear them chanting. Hundreds of people chanting, hang Mike Pence, whipping each other up to go in and hang Mike Pence. It was really fortunate they never got a hold of Mike Pence. An hour and a half response time seems a little slow under the circumstances. Thank you, honey. Yeah, Bonnie just brought me a little bit of wine, so that was good. It was a coup attempt of sorts. It reminds me of the much more successful 1953 CIA coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. CIA official Kermit Roosevelt bought mobs with millions of dollars in the Capitol to intimidate Parliament and encourage anti-democratic forces to depose the Prime Minister. Trump's was a crackpot conspiracy theory coup attempt, though. It was never plausible except in very fevered minds like those of Trump, Alex Jones, and other exotic flora and fauna. But over 140 congressmen and 8 senators did join the attempt to overturn the election, even if after the mob tried to kill or kidnap them, which means it wasn't as implausible as I wish it was. And the buy-in Trump has in the Republican Party for this coup attempt signals severe trouble ahead. Yes, it does. I hope you're getting the picture of how this was all put together. The third article is most interesting because it's about the future, or at least what Juan Cole thinks the future is going to be like. And the title of that post, it's a blog post, is called "The Armed Accelerationists Are Coming. Neo-Nazis and Boogaloo Boys plan another insurrection January 20th." And this was written today by Juan Cole, or published anyway today. The far-right militias, some of whom invaded the Capitol on January 6th, are now planning armed invasions of all 50 state capitals in advance of January 20th. If they can get all 50 state capitals, they can really show for all 50 state capitals, I'll be stunned. And if they can do that, it will be something to worry about. It will suggest they have a capacity totally unexpected before now. I mean, to orchestrate armed invasions of all 50 state capitals at once. I mean, the state capital in New York State, the state capital in California, state capital in Washington, Oregon. God. The state capital in Minnesota? All 50 state capitals in advance of January 20th, according to the FBI, and they're coming back for a second try at taking over the national capital. Good luck with that. I don't think they're going to get anywhere. There are now 15,000 troops on high alert here. I don't think they've got 15,000 who can contest them. One reason Twitter kicked Trump and QAnon and other undesirables off its platform was that they saw organizing for a January 17th uprising. These groups are what social scientists call accelerationists, quote unquote. They believe that through direct action and spectacles of violence, they can increase the speed of polarization in society, fomenting a race war, at least a war between those who firmly support the cause of the white race and those who wish to diminish its prerogatives as they see them. Some of them infiltrated last summer's Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. Yes, we saw that, engaging in violence and destruction as a false flag. That guy who went to the Target store, was breaking all the windows at the Target store, and was chased down by a peaceful protester, who asked him what he was doing there and who he was. Okay, and the guy ran away. He certainly wasn't any supporter of George Floyd. It later turned out that he was a rightist member of one of the police forces in the surrounding area. And he had gone down there specifically as a provocateur to try to create the impression that the BLMers were engaging in violence. Anyway, hoping it would be blamed on African Americans and that whites would then become alarmed and join them. These elements on last Wednesday were trying to find and kill or kidnap Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi and perhaps other legislators, in hopes of igniting nationwide violence that would benefit them. It can be a frighteningly effective tactic. Accelerationism, what I call sharpening the contradictions, quote unquote, was the tool, that Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and then ISIL used to take over 40% of Iraq. They have also had some success in pushing France to the far right and in damaging the French traditions of civil liberties and tolerance. Southern Poverty Law Center analysis notes that adulation of Trump has given many of these disparate groups a common loyalty and orientation. In essence, they have become Trump's own uh, 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 private militia, like Mussolini's black shirts. It is this loyalty to him which he has cultivated. He called them, quote, very special, unquote, on January 6th, that has endangered the Republic, since they're now determined to stop the inauguration of Joe Biden. So, who are these groups and what do they want? There are about 940 distinct hate groups in the United States, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, who, as I'm sure many of you know, have been studying these hate groups for years and years and years. With the efforts of the odious Trump and his white supremacist cronies, members of these groups have infiltrated the U.S. government. The SPLC, that is the Southern Poverty Law Center, writes, quote, Trump administration has installed members of hate groups into government, particularly those with anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, or anti-LGBTQ animus, and put in place highly punitive policies that seemed unthinkable just a few short years ago. These political moves will far outlast this administration, as Trump and his allies in the U.S. Senate have pushed through hundreds of new federal judges, many of whom are hostile to civil rights concerns and will serve for decades, unquote. That suggests something that the Biden administration has to undertake at some point, and that is going to be the impeachment of many, many of these new federal judges that were quite illegitimately pushed through the process by Mitch McConnell and by Donald Trump. There should be no hesitation in impeaching these people in the tens and maybe the hundreds, because the whole process of appointing them was severely illegitimate, norm breaking, all the time, breaking all the procedural norms that had governed the Senate, putting these people into lifetime spots. Well, there's a way to handle that. Really, a combination of two ways. You impeach some of them, you pack the courts in order to neutralize the rest. Anyway, about a dozen Capitol Police are being investigated on charges of having collaborated with the insurrectionists. The only thing you don't do is sit there and do nothing, Joe Biden, and hope to conciliate them and work both sides of the fence. You stop the moral hazard by punishing what has happened. Not all hate groups are categorized as anti-government. In 2018, SPLC identified 576 extreme anti-government organizations. Not all anti-government groups are organized on a paramilitary basis. They estimated that there are 181 militias. It was members of the militias who were dressed in military garb as they invaded the Capitol, and who appear to have contemplated violence against our elected representatives. The SPLC has gathered information on 25,000 of these people, okay, of the militiamen. Their capabilities have been vastly enhanced by the veterans of Bush's Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Blowback, the blowback that has been talked about frequently, who have joined them in significant numbers and have brought with them tactical and firearms and explosives expertise. So among the major militias are the Proud Boys, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, writes, quote, the Proud Boys are a fascist youth movement oriented towards street fighting. They're the oldest youth movement I've ever seen. The only people of the Proud Boys I seem to see on video is older, pot-bellied folks who I wouldn't call fascist by youth movement. But anyway, um, 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 okay, I guess Enrico Tario is younger than some of the ones that I've seen dancing in the streets. The group is right-wing and anti-left, in nature. Their ideology is to defend Western chauvinism. They've had several of their members convicted for violence. They were created by Vice News founder Gavin McInnes, who since has backed away from the group, according to The Guardian, 22nd November 2018. The Proud Boys rely heavily on jokes and silliness to downplay the group's proclivity for violence, both threatened and real. The current de facto leader of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, is also the Florida director of the Latinos for Trump. That's according to CNN, 1st October 2020. The Proud Boys are evolving into a more militant organization. Groups of young men increasingly show up to Proud Boy events with rifles and plate carriers. I don't even know what a plate carrier is. Somebody inform me. SPLC describes two others. Quote, 3%ism is one of three core components within the anti-government militia movement. Along with the Oath Keepers and traditional militia groups, the reference to 3% stems from the dubious historical claim that only 3% of American colonists actually fought against the British during the War of Independence. Yeah, that is dubious, I think, because as I recall, population of the colonies at that time was something like 3 million, only 3 million. Okay, that's all. So 300,000 would be 10%, and 30,000 would be 1%. And I think a lot more than 30,000 Americans fought against the British during the War of Independence. So going on. And quote, the Oath Keepers, another core component of the militia movement, was founded in 2009 by Elmer Stewart Rhodes, a veteran Army paratrooper. Yale Law School graduate and former Ron Paul congressional staffer. God. It primarily recruits current and former law enforcement military, and first responder personnel, though it also accepts civilians. Unlike 3%erism, Oath Keepers was conceived as an organization with hierarchical leadership at national, state, and local levels, one committed to establishing a network of activists it hopes will lay the groundwork for the creation of state militias. Then you have the Boogaloo Boys. The way they spell boys in French, that would be bois, the Boogaloo Bois, but I guess they don't talk that way. So Boogaloo Boys, who are not so much an organization as a set of shared beliefs expressed online, and who have ruined Hawaiian shirts for me. But they believe in an imminent race war, the Boogaloo, and are extremely violent. They use Big Luau for Boogaloo online to avoid NSA detection and engage in other wordplay. But Benjamin Goggin and Rachel Greenspan write at The Insider, quote, a loosely organized group of predominantly white men call themselves the Boogaloo Boys, a name that's come from the cult 1984 film The Break Into Electric Boogaloo, unquote. but morphed in online message boards and groups to reference a theoretical second U.S. Civil War and uprising against the federal government. Online, where almost all their organization occurs, the members have created numerous groups and pages under the names Big Igloo and Big Luau in an attempt to avoid censorship from tech platforms. The far-right group, born from 4chan's K board, which is dedicated to gun worship, has no firm central organization and only has a loose collection of shared values. Law enforcement underestimated these groups on January 6th. They must not do that again, not on January 7th or on January 20th. Trump has whipped them up with his endless lies about the election being stolen from him. And clearly, he has put Joe Biden's life in danger. And there's a bonus video here that comes with the blog that talks about the Boogaloo Boys. So there it is. So, this all sounds like more insurrection, doesn't it? And very quickly. And what Juan Cole is trying to do is to put government forces on the alert, not to downplay this threat. Okay, now I don't know if he's playing it up unnecessarily. We will learn more, but I think government forces have to be on the alert. This has been building for some time. They have plans. They've been making plans on social media. We have to make sure those plans do not come to fruition. Have to make sure about that. So, okay, this next one's a piece by Ryan Cooper. Quite sensible. What Joe Biden can learn from U.S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant. This was done on January 7th, in the week, done by Ryan Cooper. Okay. The nation has been transfixed by the attempted putsch carried out by pro-Trump fascists Wednesday. Many stunned commentators, believing in some form of American exceptionalism, reach for comparisons to other supposedly backward countries to describe what happened. Quote, "This is how election results are disputed in a banana republic," said former President George W. Bush. Yet this is not the first time that an American government has faced an epidemic of right-wing terrorism, threatening the very foundation of a democracy. Same thing happened during Reconstruction, after the Civil War, when President U.S. Grant faced a white supremacist insurrection in the South, led by the first Ku Klux Klan. Congress gave Grant sweeping powers to put down the insurrectionists. And together with Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman, he successfully snapped the neck of the Klan in a matter of months. Incoming President Biden and his choice for Attorney General Merrick Garland would be wise to follow the Grant and Ackerman lead, to follow their example. Historian Eric Foner tells the story in his sweeping study of the period, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877. Ackerman, the central figure in the anti-Klan effort, was not exactly born a radical. On the contrary, though he was born in New Hampshire, he later set up a law practice in Georgia and actually fought for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. But he had been against secession, turned against slavery during the war as he remained loyal to Georgia. After the Confederacy was defeated, he joined the Republican Party and became a legal advocate for the rights of freed slaves. He was on the moderate side of Reconstruction in terms of policy, but he still supported a radical action to defend the victory of the Civil War. This set him apart from many leaders in Washington, D.C., where he noticed, quote, hesitation to exercise the powers to redress wrongs in the states, unquote. Foner writes. But President Grant appointed Ackerman Attorney General in mid-1870 when the Department of Justice was first created. So Ackerman was the first Attorney General. I guess he wasn't the first Attorney General. He was the first head of the Department of Justice. I guess the position of the Attorney General had existed before that. Actually, I think it existed from the founding of the Republic. But the Attorney General was like an advisor to the president in that particular context. There was no department serving the federal government until the founding of the Department of Justice by Grant. So Grant wanted a determined advocate of civil rights who also had credibility in the South. By this time, the KKK, founded in 1865, had been running wild across much of the region. White supremacist terrorists assaulted, tortured, and murdered black people at random. But they assassinated members of the state legislatures and even one member of Congress, Rep. James Hines of Arkansas, a white radical Republican, and spread fear throughout the land. The objective was to overturn democracy by disenfranchising all the freed slaves and standing up a white supremacist terror state. As the Reconstruction state governments were new and barely established, they found it hard to defend themselves against KKK terror, naturally emboldening the insurrectionists to more and more aggressive acts. But the spree of violence shook the radical Republicans into action. They passed several acts empowering Grant to protect democracy, culminating in the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. This, for the first time, designated certain crimes committed by individuals as offenses punishable under federal law, said Foner. Quote, conspiracies to deprive citizens of the right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and enjoy the equal protection of the laws could be prosecuted by federal attorneys and even lead to military intervention and the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, unquote. Ackerman and Solicitor General Benjamin H. Bristow got to work. Because most state courts and juries in the South were unreliable, they set up federal courts with juries from outside the region. KKK terrorists were tracked down, arrested, indicted, tried, and punished by the thousands. In one instance, Ackerman convinced Grant to suspend habeas corpus in one exceptionally Klan-infested region of South Carolina and send in federal troops who arrested hundreds of KKK members and caused thousands of others to flee the state. All this successfully broke the Klan, which largely disappeared for more than 40 years. In, quote, terms of its larger purposes, restoring order, but reinvigorating the morale of Southern Republicans and enabling blacks to exercise their rights as citizens. The policy proved a success, unquote, concludes Foner. It's important to note the punishments for KKK terrorists were exceedingly modest by modern standards. One Klan leader got just 2 years in prison in Albany, Albany, Georgia, I presume. And while one by U.S. attorney secured nearly 700 indictments in Mississippi, most escaped with suspended sentences, and the threat of sterner punishment if violence resumed, unquote, Foner writes. The current criminal justice system is primarily oriented around vindictive cruelty and warehousing the lower class, which is why absurd, multi-decade sentences are so common today. But the length of prison sentences is largely beside the point when it comes to disrupting this kind of insurgent group, or crime of any kind for that matter. The point is to destroy the social tissue of the rebellion by demonstrating that crime will indeed be punished, by seizing the property and weapons of the insurrectionists, by disrupting their communications, by forcing them to put down arms or flee underground, and so on. With few exceptions, an insurgent group cannot stand up to a determined, organized state. There are dozens of federal laws that are applicable to Wednesday's events at the Capitol. Assaulting the federal law enforcement is illegal. Sedition is illegal. Conspiracy is illegal. Trespassing on federal property is illegal, and on and on. All sorts of anti-terrorism laws are, for once, actually appropriate. Gab, Parler, the Donald, 8kun, and other websites where the putsch was organized should be shut down as party to a seditious conspiracy, and so should any successors that crop up to replace them. In the broadest sense, the people who have plotted to overthrow the American government should be held to account and their organizing networks smashed to pieces, including Trump and the members of Congress who incited the putsch. Just as during the Reconstruction days, this will surely require going outside the traditional law enforcement apparatus because it is infested with right-wing extremists. Now, the civil rights section of the Department of Justice might be useful here. Again, the point is not punishment for its own sake, but protecting the integrity of democracy, the integrity of American democracy by suppressing insurrection. After all, there's a darker side to this history, which illustrates what is liable to happen if the political descendants of the KKK who stormed the Capitol this week are allowed to get away with treason. Later in Grant's term, the Republicans got progressively more racist and tired of defending their most loyal voting bloc, Southern blacks, and their failure to fix the economy after the economic crash of 1873 cratered their political support. Federal protection of democracy in the South was gradually rolled back, leading to a presidential election in 1876 that was marred by massive fraud and violence. But then eventually, after much high-stakes negotiation, Democrats agreed to allow Republican Rutherford B. Hayes to take the presidency so long as Reconstruction was ended. As a result, a new group of post-KKK white supremacists mounted a renewed assault against Southern democracy. As New York Times columnist Jamel Bowie points out, groups like the Red Shirts, the White League, and others got bolder and bolder when they found they were largely immune from legal punishment, and over about 20 years successfully toppled Reconstruction governments across the House. They established exactly the white supremacist terror state that Ackerman had fended off before, Jim Crow. Trump's fascist mob is glorying in what it did Wednesday, the symbolic act of occupying the seat of U.S. power, trashing congressional offices, and forcing Democratic members to run and feel, are all exactly what they have been dreaming about for years. They have owned the libs more than anyone since Robert E. Lee. It turns out if you are a white right-wing extremist who wants to storm the seat of government, the cops will just let you do it. They're certain to try ever more extreme tactics until someone forces them to stop. If President Biden wants there to be another election, or if he just wants to have as good a chance as possible of surviving his first term, he should look to our own history. So that, I think, was quite a piece, okay, as well. Let's now go to the next one. There's a whole bunch of good stuff that recently came out and that warns us about what is to come. It's so important to understand that. Title of this is America Doesn't Need New Security Laws to Prosecute Insurrection. That's Brian Cooper again. On January 10th, and he says, President-elect Joe Biden is already suggesting new laws in response to the attempted right-wing putsch against the American government this week. The Wall Street Journal reports he plans to make a priority of passing a law against domestic terrorism, has been urged to create a White House post overseeing the fight against ideologically inspired violent extremists and increasing funding to combat them. It's obvious after the past week why he would suggest such a thing, but this is a wrong-headed approach. There are plenty of tools at the government's disposal to crack down on far-right insurrection. Rather than new laws and increasing bureaucracy, Biden and incoming Attorney General Garland should enforce the laws that already exist and reform the dysfunctional security apparatus so it will do what it is told. These are necessary preconditions to fight against right-wing insurrection. As Ian Millhiser writes at Vox, there are at least a dozen federal laws that were obviously broken by at least some of the putschists. Insurrection, sedition, conspiracy, riot, assault, and murder. Capitol Police Force died of wounds that were sustained during the attack, possessing or placing explosives on federal property, robbery, trespassing. These are all extremely illegal with major penalties, given the fact that many of these yahoos were taking selfies, live streaming themselves in front of dozens of reporters and photojournalists. Any conscious federal prosecutor could put most of them away for 10,000 years if he or she felt like it. Now, there is no law specifically against domestic terrorism, but, quote, terrorism, unquote, is an extremely vague term that can and will be abused by prosecutors in future cases. It is already more than illegal enough to attempt to overthrow the government. We don't need to add more bans or punishment to the pile, because there is a much, much larger obstacle to Biden taking on the threat of right-wing insurrection: the political corruption of the security bureaucracy. We all saw on Wednesday how sympathetic police departments are to right-wing terrorists. Many rank-and-file Capitol Police did fight the insurrectionists, and one was killed by them. But others were posing for selfies or reportedly giving them directions to Chuck Schumer's office. More importantly, after the Capitol Police top brass and other law enforcement departments ignored warnings this was being planned out in the open, leaving loyal officers hanging out to dry. The mob reportedly also contained many off-duty police and members of the military who flashed their IDs as they stormed the Capitol. Most police departments and security agencies are composed largely of conservative Republicans and not a few open fascists. If you just charge the existing agencies with breaking up the domestic insurgent networks, at best they will shirk, delay, and drag their feet. And at worst, they will completely ignore the fascists while turning any new tools against Black Lives Matter and other left-wing protesters. Indeed, this is already happening. So far, the charges against the fascist mob have been trespassing or other minor crimes. rather than the felony riot charges the leftist J20 defendants defaced for simply being near minor property destruction in downtown D.C. on the day of the inauguration of Donald Trump. By the same token, neither do we need another security agency focused on domestic terrorism. On the contrary, we already have way too many security laws and institutions. The defense and intelligence establishment was already a tangled kudzu mess of overlapping agencies even before 9/11, after which the Department of Homeland Security, because perhaps the worst run agency in the government, that is saying something, was layered over the top of everything like an old pancake flopped on a pile of rotting spaghetti. After 9/11, all these agencies spent years doing dragnet surveillance on ordinary Americans, torturing people for no reason, harassing Muslims, and otherwise violating people's civil rights. It was all abusive. Much of it was illegal, and it did nothing to protect the country from any threat. The key law enforcement task for Biden and Garland, therefore, is to reform the existing security apparatus and then aim it at the insurrectionist far right. Either Garland can create special enforcement units composed of agents who are politically reliable and prosecutors who will actually keep their eye on the real threat, or better still, purge the entire security apparatus of right-wing extremists. As I wrote this week, the former option is what Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman did to smash the first Ku Klux Klan the early 1870s. While creating a single new agency would be unnecessary by itself, would be worth doing so as part of a top-to-bottom restructuring of the entire security apparatus. Fresh new agencies would allow for a clean org chart with clear lines of responsibility and disrupt existing cultures of tolerance of extremism. We could even go hog wild and require them to respect Americans' constitutional rights. What a novelty. It's hard indeed to imagine Joe Biden getting behind the total restructuring of dozens of different agencies. But Garland was involved in the 1990s effort against the violent right-wing militias and spoke about the Ackerman story in a speech accepting his nomination for Attorney General. Hopefully he can lead from both of those histories. For instance, the sacking of the Branch Davidian compound in 1993 was wildly excessive and counterproductive, but conversely, Ackerman did not need to use brutal force to break the Klan. Minor prison terms, or even the credible threat of prosecution, largely did the trick. Whatever the case, the situation is now in their hands. Yes. And now we turn to, of course, something that has to be done if we're going to begin to draw the teeth of these networks. And that is, we have to chop off the head of the leader somehow so that he can no longer be leading the movement. This article is called The Democrats' False Choice on Impeachment, and it's by David Farris, and it also appeared in the Week. And this is today, January 12th. And he says, Democrats don't have to choose between the nation's figurative and literal health. One of the major obstacles to a second impeachment of Trump is the fear that a post-inauguration trial in the Senate over his incitement to the Capitol riot, which left 5 people dead, will hold up efforts to pass additional COVID-19 relief and to fix the country's calamitous the vaccine rollout. These concerns, however, are mostly unfounded. Instead of allowing procedural rules to stand in the way of a swift trial of a dangerous outgoing president, Democrats must simply vote to change those rules to allow themselves to address our multiple crises at once. The encore impeachment of President Trump has already set off a variety of intra-party battles. One is whether to send the articles of impeachment to the Senate, while Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell still controls the chamber. despite his brief cameo as a responsible person just before the insurrection, when he dressed down colleagues planning to protest the certification of electoral votes. He has said, okay, the Senate, which is recessed, would not take up impeachment prior to the January 20th inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden. Control of the Senate won't flip to the Democrats till the two incoming Georgia Democrats are sworn in, which might not happen until as late as January 22nd. This all poses a strategic dilemma for Democrats. Impeachment now, trial later, do it all at once, call the whole thing off. The Nation's Joan Walsh worries that impeachment could bottle up Joe Biden's agenda, quote unquote. Recommends holding the articles of impeachment in the House till the Senate is ready. Rep. Jim Clyburn has suggested House Speaker Nancy Pelosi hold on to the articles throughout the mythical first 100 days of Biden's presidency. Strategists fret not just about the pandemic, but also about finding the time to confer on the members of Biden's cabinet. The fiercest opponent of forwarding articles of impeachment, while McConnell still runs the show, is ex-Daily Kos writer Armando Lorenz. I've read quite a lot of Armando's blogs, okay, at Daily Kos over the years, who fears that Mitch McConnell will hold a pro forma trial on the 21st and acquit Trump on the 22nd. Lawrence recommends that Nancy Pelosi hold the articles until Ossoff and Warnock are sworn in and new Majority Leader Chuck Schumer can refer the articles to an impeachment committee, which can then carefully collect the needed evidence without interfering with urgent recovery and confirmation efforts. He proposes this bit of arcane procedure because the Senate, the decades-old impeachment rules require a 6-day-a-week trial with no other business permitted once it gets underway. This is where the fears of torpedoing the early days of the Biden administration come in. Okay, the new president will not be taking office under ordinary circumstances, but instead in the midst of a historic, interrelated public health and economic crisis. Biden and his team really only have one chance to get this right, and whether or not they're able to deliver on their relief and vaccine timelines, apart from the enormous human consequences of failure, may very well determine how competitive Democrats will be in the 2022 midterms. The stakes could not be higher. Just as they did in 2008, the Republican Party has chugged all the mini-fridge booze, broken all the furniture, and destroyed the carpets in the National Hotel Room, leaving the whole ugly mess for Democrats to soberly clean up. The economy shed 140,000 more jobs in December as the COVID recovery collided with the vicious new surge in the virus. Hunger and homelessness are surging just as the most brutal part of the winter slams the country. I didn't think that figure was 140,000 jobs. I thought it was more like 1 million more jobs, but he may be referring to a different statistic here. But anyway, we'll know more this Thursday. The worst is yet to come. The U.S. topped 4,000 daily deaths and 300,000 cases for the first time over the past week. 7-day averages continue to rise, and hospitalizations are at a new and disturbing high. And let's see, let me get there. Let me get to where I need to get to. People who watch me frequently know where I'm going right now. So deaths today, fatalities today in the United States, according to the Worldometer site, 4,259 fatalities, over 4,000, way over 4,000. 389,599 total fatalities, about to pass 390,000 fatalities. Almost certainly, before the end of the week, we will be sitting at over 400,000 fatalities. 1,173 fatalities per million. By the way, Mr. Trump, in one of his many lying statements today, his statements at the border today were a total pack of lies. His whole narrative was a total pack, of lies. One of those lies, in which he claimed, we're protecting you from the Mexicans because if you think things are bad over here, things are really, really bad over there. They've got it a lot worse than you. I'm here to tell you, we have 1,173 fatalities per million. Discounting very small states, we are number 9 in the world. And Mexico is number 18 in the world. Well, actually, number 17, discounting very small states, because there's another very small state that comes in between the number 9 and number 20, or whatever. So Mexico is number 17 in the world. They have 1,036 fatalities per million. Once again, we have 1,173 fatalities per million. Quite a lot more. So, in other words, the wall is protecting the Mexicans from us. It's not protecting us from the Mexicans. Just had to say that. It was just too much. Where we're going is absolutely ridiculous. It's almost as bad, as the English. In the UK, they had 1,243 today. That was their fatalities for today, bringing their fatality rate per million up to 1,222 per million. Far higher than we, almost 50 higher than we now. Just about a week and a half ago, they were only 12 or 13 fatalities per million greater than we. So they've taken it on the chin this last week in a very bad way. But anyway, let's go back to the article I was sharing. 300,000 cases for the first time over the past week. 7-day averages continue to rise and hospitalizations are at a new and disturbing high. Yet President Trump stopped paying attention months ago. His administration comprehensively failed to create a unified plan to distribute the miracle vaccine developed in record time by heroic scientists around the world. Despite promises 20 million doses would be administered by the end of 2020, we're still only at about 7 million, nearly halfway through the first month of 2021. Here in Virginia, they've now gotten to the old people, so Bonnie and I can make an appointment for vaccines. So we hope to have our first shots very soon. Tens of thousands will die needlessly as a result of the Trump administration's newest demonstration of incompetence. This would be an enormously challenging situation for an incoming president to inherit, even if it were not accompanied by a rolling crisis of democracy. On the merits, President Trump either has to go now or he must be convicted by the Senate once he leaves office. His rhetoric led directly to the worst attack on the Capitol in over 200 years, leaving our elected officials defenseless and at the mercy of conspiracy-addled maniacs. It is not even entirely clear who is giving orders as the president right now, a situation that should be unacceptable even to the most hardened Republican. If only it were that simple, few have any confidence that enough of the Republicans will join Senate Democrats to meet the two-thirds threshold for conviction. But very few responsible observers believe the Democrats can heed in the GOP's bad faith calls for unity and healing and just let the whole thing go once Biden is inaugurated. As they did with the first impeachment trial just over a year ago, the party must take a stand for the integrity of democracy, even if their efforts may not succeed in banishing the president from office forever. But party leaders mustn't allow themselves to be hamstrung by Senate rules that were written long ago. Those rules are very much not in the Constitution, which unequivocally allows both chambers of Congress to set their own rules. They can be changed with a simple majority. For example, to allow an impeachment trial to be conducted at whatever pace the majority wishes. Let's say 2 half days a week until it's over. leaving plenty of time and floor space to tackle the many other pressing issues facing Americans, while also not letting go of the urgency of bringing to justice the turncoat in the Oval Office. Handing the articles of impeachment off to a Senate committee, however well-intentioned, as a solution to this procedural problem, will likely run headlong into the infamously short political memories of the American people. The trial must happen now, while the outrage is still fresh, especially since the president and his fellow insurrectionists are plotting further violence across the country. This simply cannot wait 100 days. And the Democrats can make this rule change with a simple majority, just as Republicans did to eliminate the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees in 2017, while still putting off the debate over the fate of the legislative filibuster for another day. The process is a bit arcane, but not terribly complicated. The challenge for Schumer would be convincing leading party moderates like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema to play this kind of constitutional hardball. Okay, just a point. Okay, I don't see why we have to put off the debate over the filibuster, okay, for another day. We don't need much of a debate concerning the filibuster. All they have to do is use the nuclear option, okay, to get rid of the filibuster. It can be done in a few hours. Use the nuclear option to get rid of the filibuster and change the rule. Do it the first day the Democrats have a majority in the Senate. Get rid of it then. Then all the rules changes that are necessary can be made by a majority vote without having to contend with the filibuster. This can all be done on January 22nd. Meanwhile, the House will have already impeached Trump if the bill is sent over to the Senate, and the Senate can easily have impeached Trump by January 23rd or January 24th. Then they can get to the real business of the term. There is no need for a lengthy process. He can be impeached on the one article that was found in a very, very short time. Once that is done, they can have impeachment proceedings on further articles. And I recommend that the House, after the first impeachment, or what would be actually the second impeachment, actually do a third impeachment on other grounds. Because people have to know all the illegal things Trump did while he was the president. Once he's out of office and once he's impeached and removed for good from the possibility of running, which he can be quickly, just on the one charge with which the House is passing, then there's time to go back and impeach him, okay, impeach him at a more leisurely pace in the House and in the Senate for all the rest of his crimes. And for God's sakes, forget about the Ukraine thing. Now, nobody cares about the Ukraine thing. Got to impeach him for the violations of the Emoluments Clause and for all the terrible things he did to immigrants as president, and for the separation of families. There's literally 25 things you can impeach him about. Impeach him on all 25, but forget about the thing nobody cares about, which was the goddamn Ukraine scandal. Impeach him on things that people care about. Impeach him because he's a crook. Impeach him because he betrayed the very people who support him. Impeach him because of the way he treated other human beings throughout his presidency. Impeach him and convict him for all those things. Take the time to do it. It can be done a half day a week if necessary. Once you get him out of office on the one main charge of inciting, the insurrection, once he's convicted for that, once he's barred from holding further public office, then you've got time to go back and impeach him for everything else, making careful case out for everything and entering it into the historical record and have the press cover it every single damn day. Sooner or later, Democrats are going to need to get comfortable with a bit of procedural escalation unless they want to hand power right back to an increasingly unhinged and venomous GOP in 2 years. Yeah, they have to have procedural escalation. They have to use their constitutional powers. And they have to make it clear to the public how unhinged, how venomous, and how traitorous and treasonous the Republicans have been for these last 4 years. It is essential that that be made clear to the public. Okay, so now comes the scary part. I see you're all still here. Great. I'm glad that you're still here. That's wonderful. I am going into what I am going to go into now is a dissent, a caution, certainly, a caution. It's an article by Glenn Greenwald. Worried about the power of the monopolies. I'm worried about that too. It says, how Silicon Valley in a show of monopolistic force destroyed Parler. Critics of Silicon Valley censorship for years heard the same refrain. Tech platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter are private corporations that can host or ban whoever they want. If you don't like what they're doing, the solution is not to complain or to regulate them. Instead, go create your own social media platform that operates the way you think it should. The founders of Parler heard that suggestion and tried. In August 2018, they created a social media platform similar to Twitter, but which promised far greater privacy protections, including a refusal to aggregate user data in order to monetize them to advertisers or algorithmically evaluate their interests in order to promote content or products to them. They also promised far greater free speech rights, rejecting the increasingly repressive content policing of Silicon Valley giants. Over the last year, Parler encountered immense success. Millions of people who objected to increasing repression of speech on the largest platforms or had themselves been banned signed up for the new social media company. The Silicon Valley censorship radically escalated over the past several months, banning pre-election reporting by the New York Post about the Biden family, denouncing and deleting multiple posts from the U.S. president, then terminating his access altogether, mass removal of right-wing accounts. So many people migrated to Parler that it was catapulted to the #1 spot on the list of most downloaded apps on the Apple Play Store, the sole and exclusive means which iPhone users have to download apps. Overall, the app was the 10th most downloaded social media app in 2020, with 8.1 million new installs. It looked as if Parler had proven critics of Silicon Valley monopolistic power wrong. Their success showed that it was possible, after all, to create a new social media platform to compete with Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and they did so by doing exactly what Silicon Valley defenders long ago insisted should be done. If you don't like the rule imposed by tech giants, create your own platform with different rules. But today, if you want to download, sign up for, or use Parler, you're going to be unable to do so. That's because three Silicon Valley monopolies, Amazon, Google, and Apple, abruptly united to remove Parler from the internet exactly at the moment when it became the most downloaded app in the country. If one were looking for evidence to demonstrate that these tech behemoths are in fact monopolies that engage in anti-competitive behavior in violation of antitrust laws and will obliterate any attempt to compete with them in the marketplace. It would be difficult to imagine anything more compelling than how they just used their unconstrained power to utterly destroy a rising competitor. The United Silicon Valley attack began on January 8th when Apple emailed Parler and gave them 24 hours to prove, my birthday, by the way, to prove they had changed their moderation practices or else face removal from their app store. A letter claimed, quote, "We have received numerous complaints regarding objectionable content in your Parler service. Accusations that the Parler app was used to plan, coordinate, and facilitate the illegal activities in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021 that led, among other things, to loss of life, numerous injuries, and the destruction of property," unquote. It ended with this warning. To ensure there's no interruption of the availability of your app on the App Store, please submit an update and the requested moderation improvement plan within 24 hours of the date of this message. If we do not receive an update compliant with the App Store review guidelines and the requested moderation improvement plan in writing within 24 hours, your app will be removed from the App Store. The 24-hour letter was an obvious pretext and purely performative. Removal was a fait accompli no matter what Parler did. To begin with, the letter was immediately leaked to BuzzFeed, which published it in full. A Parler executive detailed the company's unsuccessful attempts to communicate with Apple. Quote, "They basically ghosted us," unquote, he told me. The next day, Apple notified Parler of its they notified them of the removal from the App Store. Quote, "We won't distribute apps that present dangerous and harmful content," unquote, said the world's richest company. And thus, quote, "We have now rejected your app for the App Store." It is hard to overstate the harm to a platform from being removed from the App Store. Users of our iPhones are barred from downloading apps onto their devices from the internet. If an app is not on the App Store, it cannot be used on the iPhone. Even iPhone users who have already downloaded Parler will lose the ability to receive updates, will shortly render the platform both unmanageable and unsafe. In October, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law issued a 425-page report concluding that Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google all possess monopoly power and are using that power anti-competitively. For Apple, they emphasized the company's control over iPhones through its control of access to the App Store. As Ars Technica put it when highlighting the report's key finding, Apple controls about 45% of the U.S. smartphone market, 20% of the global smartphone market, the committee found, and is projected to sell its 2 billionth iPhone in 2021. It is correct that in the smartphone handset market, Apple is not a monopoly. Instead, iOS and Android hold an effective duopoly in mobile operating systems. However, the report concludes Apple does have a monopolistic hold of what you can do with an iPhone. You can only put apps on your iPhone through the Apple App Store, and Apple has total gatekeeper control over that App Store. That's what Epic is suing the company over. The committee found internal documents showing that company leadership, including former CEO Steve Jobs, acknowledged that IAP by requirement would stifle competition and limit the apps available to Apple's customers. The report concludes that Apple has also unfairly used its control over APIs, search rankings, and default apps to limit competitors' access to iPhone users. Shortly thereafter, Parler learned that Google, without warning, had also suspended it from its Play Store, severely limiting the ability of users to download Parler onto Android phones. Google's actions also meant that those using Parler on their Android phones would no longer receive necessary functionality and security updates. It was precisely Google's abuse of its power to control its app device that was at issue, quote, when the European Commission deemed Google LLC as the dominant undertaking in the app stores for the Android operating system, i.e. Google Play Store, and hit the online search and advertising giant with 4.34 billion euros for its anti-competitive practices to strengthen its position in various other markets through its dominance in the App Store market. The day after United Apple and Google acted against Parler, Amazon delivered the fatal blow. The company, founded and run by the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, I think, what's his name? Elon Musk is now the world's richest man, isn't he? Used virtual identical language as Apple to inform Parler that its web hosting service, AWS, was terminating Parler's ability to have AWS host its site. Quote, because Parler cannot comply with our terms of service and poses a very real risk to public safety, we plan to suspend Parler's account effective Sunday, January 10th at 11:59 p.m. PST. Because Amazon is such a dominant force in web hosting, Parler has thus far not found a hosting service for its platform, which is why it has disappeared not only from app stores and phones, but also from the internet. On Thursday, Parler was the most popular app in the U.S. By Monday, 3 of the 4 Silicon Valley monopolies united to destroy it. So anyway, then Glenn goes on and talks about how liberals, in the U.S. were celebrating misuse of Silicon Valley monopoly power. And he goes on, in this vein for some time. And how some of the progressives in Congress, like AOC, had pressured Apple and Google to do something about the way Parler was operating. There's a policing site on the internet called Sleeping Giants. It flagged several Parler posts that called for violence. And AOC asked, what are at Apple and at Google Play doing about this, unquote. Once Apple took Parler out of the App Store, which was a move House Democrats just 3 months earlier warned was dangerous antitrust behavior, she praised Apple. AOC did, and she demanded to know, quote, good to see this development from at Apple and at Google Play. What are you going to do about apps being used to organize violence on your platform? And so the call is, if the apps are being used to organize violence, then get rid of the apps. And Michelle Goldberg, of the Times, though she had the same take, on the platforms, saying it's dangerous to have a handful of callow young tech titans in charge of who has a megaphone and who does not, she still praised them for using their dangerous power to ban Trump and destroy Parler. Okay. In other words, he makes the point that liberals such as Goldberg are concerned only that Silicon Valley censorship powers might one day be used against people like them, but is perfectly happy as long as their adversaries being deplatformed and silenced. Facebook and other platforms has for years banned marginalized people like Palestinians at Israel's behest, but that is of no concern to U.S. liberals. I think that's a little bit unfair, and the reason why I do is because I don't equate the people who are running Parler with the people with what the liberals are saying, okay, and doing. Generally speaking, okay, the progressives, okay, and the liberals do not advocate for violence. The violent advocacy for violence is not found on platforms. I shouldn't say on platforms, but on pages, on, let's say, the Facebook platform, okay, or Twitter. That kind of advocacy does not occur there. So I think that's a false equivalence. Okay. I also don't think, okay, that liberals are perfectly happy as long as it is their adversaries that are being deplatformed and silenced. No, I think the liberals are perfectly happy, okay, that it is the fascists, the totalitarians, who are being deplatformed and silenced. And I think that, okay, is different. Okay, I understand that censorship powers, okay, are very dangerous. Okay, but if we were to reform, and I'm all for reforming and regulating and controlling the tech giants, okay, and their platform, and having laws, okay, for doing this. These laws must be constructed, okay, in a very careful way, that while seeing to it that the nature of exchange on these platforms is civil, the content on the platforms, substantive content, is not restricted, that people are free to voice ideas they wish to voice, as long as they do not advocate for violence. In other words, I think democracy isn't a suicide pact. I think democracies have the right to defend themselves. Okay. I don't like it that it was the tech giants that were using their power. But if we were able to devise a system where regulation, well, first of all, I would break up the giants. I would start there. I would break them up into many different platforms so people could easily switch from platform, okay, to platform. But I would also watch, okay, the platforms for speech that goes beyond the kind of speech that is consistent with a democratic political system, small d democratic. So I could go on with this in far more detail, but from what I see, okay, of this particular post, okay, by the way, okay, I agree that we don't want a world media power. We don't want that. Okay, but okay, in this case, Trump was shouting fire in a crowded theater. That's what he was doing. He was fomenting the violent insurrection that we are now in the middle of us. And we have a right to defend ourselves against that by censoring certain kinds of speech. I'm well aware of the dangers that once we say that's okay, that we have to combat the possibility that the authorities would use those kinds of power against us. And I'm well aware we have to fight like hell against that. But I don't think that to fight like hell against that, we have to give people the absolute freedom to say anything they want, in whatever environment they want, but no matter who they are. It's one thing for a person standing on a soapbox in the middle, of Lafayette Park, to be advocating for, extreme activity when there are 25 people who are gathering around him. It's another thing to have the advocacy of violence when there are 50,000 people that are gathered around the same speaker, or when that speaker is the President of the United States, who's been building a movement for years and years and years, and he or she advocates for violence in that kind of context. That is a different type, of situation, where there is a clear and and present danger of harm coming to people. Anyway, there's more of this and more of finding it troubling that Parler could be destroyed by the monopolies. Again, I find that troubling too. What I would do about it is break up the monopolies very quickly, and make sure they are divided into many small platforms whose rules are different, and whose rules are the product of bottom-up decisions by their participants. And yes, if the participants were to create rules hostile to democracy, then I would be for the government taking away their corporate charter. There's a simple remedy for that kind of thing. If the company that's created and is running a platform is running an anti-democracy platform, that is not something that I would allow. Anyway, going on. And so Glenn says, it's true one can find postings on Parler that explicitly advocate violence or otherwise grotesque, but that even more true of Facebook, Google owned by YouTube, and Twitter. And contrary to what many have been led to believe, Parler's terms of service includes a ban on explicit advocacy of violence. They employ a team of paid and trained moderators who delete such postings. Those deletions do not happen perfectly or instantaneously, which is why one can find postings that violate these rules. But the same is true of every major Silicon Valley platform. I think that is not good enough. I mean, I'm glad that Parler was doing that, but I don't think that, is good enough. In other words, if there is explicit advocacy, of violence, then there have to be enough staff on that particular platform and a sufficient degree of algorithmic power that between the algorithmic power and the staff, that but those deletions have to happen nearly perfectly and nearly instantaneously. Because if a platform is allowing the organization of violence through its communications, it just cannot be tolerated. It cannot continue to exist. Okay, so Glenn makes the point that posts that explicitly advocate violence that it's even more true that these posts appear on Facebook and YouTube, and Twitter. Well, I would say that with respect to Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, that it has to be the responsibility of those companies or successor companies after they are broken up to moderate speech on their platforms in that way. No advocacy of violence. Protest movements have to be nonviolent. It must be illegal for them to be violent. And therefore, it must be illegal to have platforms that allow the advocacy, of violence. That's just a responsibility we have to place on the people who run the platforms. It's just going to be a business cost. They have to absorb that business cost. The people who invested in Parler could have absorbed that business cost. Evidently, a Parler executive said to Glenn Greenwald that of the 13 people who were arrested as of Monday for the breach of the Capitol, none appear to be active users, of Parler. I don't know how relevant, that actually is, because a lot more people are going to be arrested, and many of them may turn out to be active users, of Parler. The point is made, the Capitol breach was planned far more on Facebook, and YouTube. So, I'm all for Facebook and YouTube getting broken up and putting people who are more interested in controlling that in control of the successor companies. And the AVAS group says, in D.C., we saw QAnon conspiracists and other militias that would never have grown to this size without being turbocharged by Facebook, and Twitter. I do agree about that. That's to say nothing of the endless number of hypocrisies with Silicon Valley giants feigning opposition to violent rhetoric or political extremism. Amazon, for instance, is one of the CIA's most profitable partners, with a $600 million contract to provide services to the agency, and is constantly bidding for more. On Facebook and Twitter, one finds official accounts from the most repressive and violent regimes on earth, including Saudi Arabia, in pages devoted to propaganda on behalf of the Egyptian regime. I'm against that. No, I don't think they have a genuine concern about violence and extremism. I do think the successor companies to these tech giants should be prohibited from allowing pages on their platforms that are devoted to propaganda from repressive and violent regimes. I don't think they should have the right to disseminate that kind of propaganda here in the United States. So why do Democratic politicians and journalists focus on Parler rather than Facebook, and YouTube? Well, because the Silicon Valley giants donate enormous sums of money to the Democratic Party and their leaders. That's absolutely right. Glenn is absolutely right there. Part of it is because Parler is such an upstart, a much easier target to try to destroy. That's also right. And this particular motive, this very corrupt motive, was made explicitly clear by longtime Clinton operative Jennifer Palmieri, who'll probably be active in the Biden administration too. It's not escaped my attention that today social media companies decide there actually is more they could do to police Trump's destructive behavior. It was the same day they learned Democrats would chair all the congressional committees that oversee that. Yeah, yep, she's right. Parler is associated with the wrong political ideology. That is true. But the wrong political ideology is not simply the wrong political ideology. It is a political ideology that is clearly advocating for violence and clearly advocating for fascism. And the comment is made, the final paragraph. No authoritarians believe they are authoritarians, no matter how repressive are the measures they support. Censorship, also monopoly power, no-fly lists for American citizens without due process. They tell themselves those they are silencing, attacking are so evil, a terrorist. Anything done against them is noble, but despotic and repressive. That is how American liberals currently think as they fortify the control of Silicon Valley monopolies over our political lives, exemplified by the overnight destruction of a new and popular competitor. Well, there's much in this statement by Glenn, which is very good. There's much, that I agree with. But in the particular situation we are in now, I do approve of the destruction of Parler, and I do approve of the general move towards removing violent posts or posts that advocate for violence from social media. That is very, very important now, I think, for the survival of our democracy. Okay, I'm ready for your comments now. Okay, I'm ready to entertain them all. I'll go back to the beginning. It may take me some time. I may be here till 1 o'clock tonight, but I will try. Kay says, he put Cuba on the watch list too. I know. That was ridiculous. Put Cuba on the watch list. That was really ridiculous. Steve says, don't get me started on Clintons and Podestas involved in pedophilia, says Steve Wolfbrand. Evelina says, not funny, actually. Steve says, wasn't meant to be funny. Steve Wolfbrand, I was referring to my own reaction. No, it's not funny. Kay says, Clintons are as corrupt as they can be in many ways, says Kay. Well, I agree with that. I just have this skepticism in thinking that Hillary Clinton was involved in a pedophile ring, but operating out of a DC pizzeria. I'm very skeptical about that, folks. I'm sorry. That just sounds like a story to me. Steve Gonzo says, Canada considers adding, on a right-wing story, by the way, Canada considers adding Proud Boys to terrorist list alongside ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. I don't know how Canada manages, the terrorist list, whether, it's at all justified or makes any sense. Obviously, it's got ISIS, and Al-Qaeda on it. But those two things, are good. But this idea of taking whole states, like, for example, Iran, calling Iran a terrorist state, that is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Just ridiculous. She Sexton says it's not okay an insurrection. Why wasn't it not okay an insurrection? There was an attack motivated by the President of the United States on the Congress of the United States. That is an attack by the executive branch on the sovereignty of the legislative branch. That was on the point of doing one of its ceremonial duties that it is prescribed to do. That is an act of insurrection, trying to stop the Congress from performing a ministerial duty of accepting the electoral votes. That qualifies as an insurrection, that kind of action. D.S. Swift said, is taping and recording legal in Georgia? Obviously, yeah. In Georgia, in fact, it only requires the consent of one of the parties. It's one of those repressive states that doesn't require both parties. So Steve says, the military joint chiefs consider the attack on the Capitol to be sedition. Yes, an act of sedition. Yes, that's what the military calls it. Bill Clinton flew on Epstein's plane like 26 times. Yeah, I'm ready to believe that. I believe that. I just don't believe that Hillary was running a pedophile thing out of a D.C. pizzeria. Now, as far as the Podesta emails are concerned, well, I don't know. I didn't read them. Is that what is said in the Podesta email, Steve? I mean, I'll take your word for it if you tell me you read that, according to these emails, that Hillary was involved in a pedophile ring. Steve Gonzo says, all right, who got Steve started? It was me. Dean Parfit Sr. says, Joseph, you are a douchebag. You have fun with Joe and his pedophile son. No, I don't. You know exactly what happened. You know Antifa was there to incite the riot. I'm fine with your lies and bullshit. Peace out. Well, there we go. Guess we got a Trumpist here. And I'm a douchebag. And Dia Swift said, Chad Wolf is a goner, but he assisted fascism and chaos. I hope he goes to prison. He's kind of purdy, don't you know? Dia Swift said, Pence must be a real cream pie. Hillary, and Kay says, Hillary is why we got rubbed to begin with. Yep. Steve says, don't even bring up the Obamas. Yeah. And Dia says, he's Machiavellian for sure. Who's Machiavellian? Clinton? Obama? Yes, certainly. Kay says, Obama's Troy Fountain says, hey, everyone, I'm late, but here. Hey, Troy, why are you on Facebook tonight rather than on YouTube? Steve Wolfbrand says, hey, Kay says, Status Quo's live video has made on MSDNC on the coup. Oh, you mean that his live video was put up, Kay, on NBC. I see, MSDNC. Facebook says they warned Ellie well before the Capitol riot. They warned Ellie. Who's Ellie? Okay. Is Ellie the Capitol Police? Is Ellie the FBI? See, says, are those the Bugle Boys from Company D? I don't think so. Lana, Dell hates the clock says the Minnesota governor has requested the National Guard. Case says coming in Ohio Saturday, and damn, the DeWine just signed the Stand Your Ground law. Oh, God. We don't need Stand Your Ground laws. Okay, Dia Swift said, it's really a good thing that maggots are so stupid to announce their uprising. Hilarious, actually. Steve Gonzo says, 2 officers in Oregon suspended for opening doors for protesters. Troy Fountain says, "Oh, I've been following Professor Juan Cole for decades. We were both um, 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 we were both Baha'is for a moment. Then he wrote a book called Modernity and the Millennium. The High, uh, the Baha'i headquarters in Haifa didn't like the book, so that was that. Dia Swift said saboteurs, and Lauderdale said yes. The mysterious guy breaking the windows in Minneapolis was an off-duty cop from St. Paul, if memory serves. Yeah, that's what my memory said. Yeah, go put your phone number and address on Parler for all to see. Troy Astro. No politician in history ever was impeached twice. Incredible. Okay, and Dia Swift said, Batteria went to jail in D.C. Yeah. Troy says, leaving Facebook for a while. I'll pick this up via YouTube. Steve says, that a plate carrier is a waitress. That's what I thought. Old Gringo says, hola, amigos. Now I'm over here. Hola, old Gringo. And Dia Swift said, however, the invisible hand of the Klan is still the most powerful and dangerous hate group in government and corporations. Evelina says, I can't believe this Enrique Tarrio guy does have ties with Venezuela right wing or maybe a Cuban-American gangster. Probably. Oh, Gringo says, reminds me of Un, deux, trois, les cerises au les bois. Les cerises au les bois. Steve Wolfbrand says the Boogaloo Boys the Bugaboo Boys have very small penises. I have no comment on that. Bill Stokes says that reads as a who's who of groups terrorizing Portland for years. Lana says, how are you, old Gringo? Is the something still running your life? Steve Wolfman, they drive very large pickup trucks. Steve Gonzo says, all incels. And Mark Beauregard says, can you change this to a bunch of idiots who are only able to gain interest in the Capitol because the entire force of thousands who usually protect the place abandon their post? This would have only been a laughable, idiotic attempt if everyone hadn't been ordered to vacate the premises. I hope we get that cleared up in the investigation that's coming up. That might very well have been the case. Case says, I used to work in an old building, in Massillon, Ohio, that was a stop on the underground by railroad back then. Evelina says, KKK group forced out of the state. So which other state had the pleasure? Steve Gonzo says, authorities release image of man wanted for killing of Capitol Police officer David Quantoville, a Chicago firefighter. Steve Phillips says, apparently this country's been very violent for a very long time. Yes. Steve says, really? Kay says, we always have. Steve says, hi, Lana. I was AFK for a bit there. Yes, the cat still owns me. Laugh out loud. Steve Gonzo tweets something, or Steve Gonzo links to a tweet. Okay, or links to a video. I can't tell what it is, but you can tell. And old Gringo says, I agree, Biden needs to crack down or else it's going to be a bad 4 years. Steve Wolfbrand said, but UFO disclosure is coming. Yeah, I've heard that too, Steve. And old Gringo says, right wing at work asked me why Democratic-controlled D.C. didn't enforce against the White House break-in and why they just were let in. Well, the Capitol police controlled by both houses of Congress, and they were the ones who were there. Okay, the D.C. police weren't let in there for a while. They could not get to it. Steve Wolfbrand said, watch the documentary, The Phenomenon. Jonathan Bonham says Trump is getting a bad deal here. Kay says, we've been losing our tights for 50 years. Dia Swift said, it's the Klan behind the thin blue line. It's the Klan behind the political donations from corporations. They have to be smoked out and snuffed out. So the rest of the world knows nothing, just Israel, okay, and the United States. Steve says, is that why your panties, okay, are in a bunch? I agree, Dia. But Dia says, impeach Clyburn, so sick of him. Kay says, my panties are just fine. It is a fact. Lana says, but listening to Jim Jordan's remarks today was slightly infuriating. What is wrong with these people? He should be ashamed. He should be kicked out of the frickin' Congress. Bill Stokes says, 2 civil suits were thrown out in Portland yesterday that challenged the police tactic of kettling. That's where police surround a group of peaceful protesters and threaten force of violence if they don't leave. Yeah, that's really terrible. That's terrible. And Gringo says, breaking news, Pence rejects call for 25th Amendment. I always see my news alerts late still. Evelina says, Viva Mexico. And then she says, laugh out loud. Old Gringo says, ex-Governor Rick Snyder being charged for Flint the water disaster. I'll bet Jordan carried that one. Heather, I'll bet Jordan was involved in that one. Jordan Chariton. Heather Edwards says, today Trump repeatedly said no violence. They're going to do their best to incite violence. Just avoid the capitals and let them be caught. He is warning us. Kay says, there are many expat communities in Mexico. I know. Kay Dia says, at least 4 various mutations of COVID found. The gorillas are catching it. Will house pets be next? And Lana Dell says, bless you, what's the nuclear option? Okay, the nuclear option is sometimes called the constitutional option. Okay, and what it means is, okay, it's a parliamentary maneuver that can be used to bring up a vote on the filibuster rule. It's a parliamentary maneuver that can be used at any time. Okay, and whether the filibuster is then junked or goes forward depends on a majority rule of the Senate. Okay, it depends on a majority vote, of the Senate. So if even a majority of 1 votes to get rid of the filibuster rule, that's it. The filibuster is gone. No more filibuster. All decisions would be made in the Senate by majority rule going forward. Okay, unless, of course, some idiot group were to reimpose the filibuster at some future time. But once it's gone, I think public opinion would be so opposed to having the filibuster come back that I don't think it would ever come back. Kay says, I've been warning Ohio people. Okay, anyway, Lana, what you can do is look up the nuclear option or the constitutional option. There's a Wikipedia article. I'll explain it in detail. And then I've also got some old blogs that you'll find on my you could find these old blogs on the All Life is Problem Solving site. Okay, I did a number of blogs in 2009 and 2010 that explained the constitutional option, for the nuclear option for getting rid of the filibuster. Now, they have used that already. The Republicans used it to get rid of the filibuster for the judicial nominees. And they've used it for other purposes. They just haven't gone whole hog and used it to get rid of the filibuster when it comes to legislation. So Lana says, good news on Snyder. We still have to wait to see if they actually convict him. And Steve Gonzo says they met in Colorado before dispersing to surrounding State House riots. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, but Dia Swift says, um, um, FFs are the Democrats going to botch this impeachment up again. If they listen to dolts like Clyburn, they will lose all respect. Yeah, he is a dolt. And Evelyn says Colorado. Steve says Ohio. Oh, Columbus, Ohio is where they met. Okay, and Dia Swift says, have you seen all the poor migrants freezing in Bosnia? Heart-wrenching. Yeah, uh, things are very bad with COVID, okay, in Bosnia as well. Sandy Degg says, the vote urging Pence and cabinet to remove Trump from office, 25th Amendment, H.R. 21, yes votes win. Oh, that's a vote on the resolution urging Pence and the cabinet to remove him, okay, from office. Kay says Pence won't do it. I don't think Pence will do it either. Steve says Parler required valid. I think it was a waste of time for Congress to try. They should have gone straight to impeachment Monday morning. Should have gone straight to impeachment Friday morning. They really should have. Steve says Parler required valid ID. Now there's your no-fly list. I don't know. That there are probably a lot of people on Parler who were not the right-wing extremists. So, are you going to take away everybody's right to fly? Who went to Parler? Evelina Pont says, is that a fact? Steve Gonzo said, Pence needs a no-fly list. Sandy Dick says, I have never heard of Parler. It was a platform that was used by a lot of the right-wing extremists, fascists. But thus far, the 13 people who have been arrested in connection with the Capitol riots, evidently not one was using Parler to organize this. Case has been hearing about it for several months now. Dia Swift says Geraldo supports impeachment. Who cares what Geraldo supports? I guess there are people who care. And Deborah Wolf said, I ducked out, but once again, view Oliver Stone's Untold History of the U.S. with hubby. Everyone should watch this series. Dia Swift says, Neil Young, yes, they should. And Dia Swift says, but Neil Young felt sadness and compassion, okay, for the manipulated Capitol rioters. I don't feel sadness and compassion for people who were doing violence to other people. I'm sorry. If there were people who went there to protest, I can feel sadness and compassion for them. But going as far as violence, that's where I draw the line. I don't feel sadness and compassion for them. Steve Gonzo says, the firefighter with the extinguisher at the Capitol was not on my bingo card. Russell Goldman says, this is where Angela Merkel is correct, that our legislature should be doing their job to legislate the behaviors and scopes of responsibilities by the tech company providers, and then see to it that the laws are enforced. Angela Merkel is quite right. Bob Shuey said, what happened to all the shit that was supposed to go down today? All the guys who regularly make all the videos about insurrection were nowhere to be found today. But Bob, was there some violence today somewhere? Okay, I'm not aware of any today, but there might have been, as far as I know. Evelina Pont says, first step, break up the rich tech giants, break up tech giants. And Steve Gonzo says the article text is too blurry to read here, Joe. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve. But I left the link to it, so you can go to the article from the link and you can read it there. Sorry. I should have taken myself out of the picture and made it larger. Kay says, all monopolies need to go. Evelina says, breaking them up sure won't be easy. Actually, I think it will be easy. They're all monopolists. If the Biden administration wants to break them up and they apply the law, they can break them up. All of them are monopolists. I mean, we've broken up very big monopolies in the past. AT&T, of course, was broken up. We can break up any one of these monopolies, all four of them. We can break up all four of them. But we got to get started. We got to break them into component companies. I think current law will suffice. Sherman and Clayton will do the trick. We don't need any more laws to do it. We just need people who will enforce the laws, the anti-monopoly laws. Okay, and Dia Swift said, but Luxembourg calls Trump a criminal and a political pyromaniac who should be sent to criminal court. Gotta agree. Kay says, no, it sure won't, but they all need to go ASAP. IndependentLeft.news says, hi, friends. IndependentLeft.news says, the Greenwald piece. Yeah, the Greenwald piece is a good piece. Okay, I agree with a lot of it, but I think it just goes too far in the conclusions it draws. It seems to be saying that just no censorship, never any censorship. Doesn't matter what people say, doesn't matter what they advocate for, doesn't matter how violent the rhetoric is. It seems to be an absolutist position when it comes to censorship. I'm pretty close to an absolutist when it comes to censorship. I really am. I think that Glenn is right when it comes to all the things that he's advocated for when it comes to freedom of the press. I mean, I think that he's right about that. I'm concerned and irate about it and angry about all the things that he's angry about there. But when it comes to shutting Trump down on social media, when there is clear and present danger of insurrection in the country due to Trump's activities, I think that action by people in these tech companies was far too slow. It should have been done right after the election. Right after the election, right after he refused to concede, right after he started contending there was all this fraud in the particular election, he should have been deplatformed at that time. Now, his lawsuits were perfectly all right. His own news conferences, perfectly fine. All that stuff, perfectly fine. But after that, no counts on Twitter. Too dangerous. With the movement he had grown, it was too dangerous. So Dia Swift said, tensions boil over at Virginia City Council meeting of 2 cops are caught participating in a Capitol riot by Sky Palmer. Kyle Griffin. At Kyle Griffin. Breaking. House has approved the resolution calling on Pence to remove Trump via the 25th Amendment. It took them long enough. I think Pelosi was planning this. She wanted it to take this long because you know why? She was probably planning on putting through Clyburn's bullshit plan of waiting 100 days to really do anything. She was just giving us a line of bullshit from the start. Kay says, the U.S. is a corporate-owned country, and it needs to end. And IndependentLeft.news says, wow. Anthony says, Steve says, coup cela. Bill Stokes says, what about liability and accountability? Seems like would be a simple way to end this particular debate. I'm not sure which specific debate you're talking about, but obviously we are talking about liability and accountability. And Dia Swift said, Trump was pleased by Capitol siege until aides warned he has legal exposure, New York Times reporter. Rob Rivera says, hey, Yoda, hey, Rob. And, law enforcement. So where did, hey, Yoda, yeah. Pancho Villa says, Trump's going to jail, then hell. Pancho Villa. Okay, Deborah Wilson said, we're also an Israel-owned country. Well, Sheldon Adelson died. He's dead. So maybe we're not owned anymore, okay, by Israel. Seems to me Sheldon Adelson owned both Israel and the United States. But he's gone now. Pancho Villa says, but Parler equals Nazi press. And Rob Rivera says, I have been shocked at what has been happening, but even more shocked at people on the left cheering on the censorship. I can't believe what I'm reading on social media. I'm not saying that people didn't say things to get banned, but the blowback of this has been also censoring people on the left. It's only going to get worse. Look, I'm very much against people censoring people on the left. People on the left, as far as I know, are not advocating for violence. They're not, they may be organizing protests, but they're not organizing violent protests. I'm not aware of any of that going on the left. That's been going on the right, though. So, we're talking about censoring different kinds of speech, talking about speech which is guaranteed under the First Amendment to the Constitution. Of course, the big platforms don't have to respect the First Amendment, and I'm sincerely opposed to that. That's reason enough for me to break them up. I think they ought to be broken up because I think they should be made to guarantee First Amendment rights to people speaking on their platforms. But First Amendment rights to advocate for violence are limited. They're limited to particular situations. You cannot shout fire in a crowded theater, not when there's a clear and present danger of violence occurring. Trump did that. He did that. That makes his further attempts to do that censorable, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I completely agree with you that the tech platforms are too powerful. We need to break them up. Let's keep our eye on the ball. That's breaking them up because they're too powerful. But that's the ball. They're too powerful. The idea that they could censor Trump and shut him down, okay, or that they did censor Trump, okay, and shut him down, that's a different point. Okay, it's a different issue. I mean, they had the power anyway. So better they shut him down than that they did not. On the other hand, if they had tried to shoot down people who were trying to organize peaceful protests in Washington, D.C., comprised of people exercising their constitutional rights, that would have been wrong. That would have been wrong. So Dia Swift said, how can he put Cuba on the watch list, but is encouraging Terrio to overthrow Capitol Hill? Because, of course, people he likes can do anything they want. And people and countries he doesn't like get put on watch lists, on terror lists, and get bombed, and get economic sanctions against them. That's what it's about. It's pure criminality. He's engaged in pure criminality all the time. And Rob says, if people are posting things that are questionable, and it needs to be determined in a court of law that deals with hate speech. I fear of new domestic terrorist laws is another even more aggressive Patriot Act can be abused to deem anyone challenging the government. I fear that too, Rob, because I'm challenging the government all the time. So I fear that. But that's not what was happening here. What was happening was that they were shutting down Donald Trump when there was a clear and present danger of his causing more violence, which he undoubtedly caused on January 6th. Independent Left.News says John Serena from the Capitol was put on MSNBC for status coup, and Chris Hayes gave him credit. LE is law enforcement. Thank you, Indie Left. And Russell Gorman says, got to call it a night. Thanks for being here this long, Russ. It's great to see you. Steve Gonzo says, all of the above, law enforcement. Okay, Dia Swift said law enforcement. LEOs means law enforcement officers. You got to get with the street lingo, Dr. J. Thanks, Dia. Oh, Gringo says like. Oh, Gringo says share. Oh, Gringo says, I got to run. Aloha, oh, Gringo. Dia says, I like your deft coverage tonight. I'll be checking in more often. Thanks for the great presentation and coverage. Thank you, Dia. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And Lana says, good night, OG. And Anthony gives us a clover leaf. Lana says, I want to know when that crazy Q chick from CO, but newly elected, I think, who was tweeting to the Trumpers on Wednesday about where Pelosi was in the building is going to be arrested. Oh, are you talking about the QAnon chick? Because I think the QAnon chick is from Georgia. I don't think she's from Colorado, but she is, though, a newly elected congressperson. I think she ought to be arrested and immediately expelled from the Congress. That is going way too far. Sandy says they're going for impeachment tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Great. But then the issue becomes, if they impeach him by noon, are they going to hold off on sending it to the Senate until afterwards? There's enough time for the Senate to have a trial now. I think the Senate's got to get its butt back in. But Dia Swift says, so that's how the quick no-fly list came about. Kay says, I'm tired. I need to go to bed. Thank you all for another great discussion. I love you all. We love you, Kay. Thank you for coming. Steve says, no fly list, just joking. D meant a parlor would be a data mine to investigate. Yeah, probably. But data mining, though, is often used to oppress people and probably will be in the case of Parler. And Lana says, good to know you are a fan, D-I-A, Dia. Dr. Joe is very good about the details. Dia says it's good stuff. Yeah, I think Nancy was listening to Fish-Eyed Clyburn. Arsenio Rodriguez says that was going on for 4 years, burning and looting. You stupid motherfucker. I don't know who is the stupid motherfucker. Maybe it's me. What was going on for 4 years? Burning and looting. Looding. What are you talking about, Arsenio? In a corporate state, corporate censorship is state censorship. Well, I'm afraid that may be a good aphorism, Caitlin. I bet this is Caitlin Johnstone, okay, that you're quoting, Steve. And there's much to that. Okay, there's much to that. But from a legal point of view, of course, it isn't true. Okay, but anyway, I am not saying that these big corporations had a moral right to censor people. But under the present system, they did have a legal right, okay, to censor people. In my view, the way the situation should be handled is to break up these very huge corporations that are monopolistic, okay, in character. There's no justification for them to be this large and to be allowed to continue to exist in this state. They need to be broken up. No ifs, ands, or buts. Rob says a senator in Maryland was defining a domestic terrorist as a person who influences the policy by a government, either by influence or coercion, can mean anything and will be abused. Well, of course, it can mean anything and will be abused. And we need to be opposed to any law that defines a domestic terrorist but that way. And Lana says, there is another one in Colorado. Oh, God. And Mark Damon says, the Attorney General of D.C. plans on pressing charges on Trump if he's pardoned on federal charges. If he's pardoned on federal charges, it would have to be either a self-pardon or a pardon by Pence. So, I think we're done. It's 12:21. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for staying. Thank you very much for the conversation and for the questions and for the information. I'm so glad you all came. I'm very glad you're still here. There are 19 of you still here. That's really terrific. So, have a great night, and I will see you tomorrow. It's Wednesday night. Tomorrow, I will probably be back again at 9:30 because I have maybe 9:15 or 9:30. I have to see. I have a meeting starting at 8 o'clock tomorrow that it shouldn't run past 9, but I need a little time to set up. So it might be 9:15 tomorrow instead of 9. But it might be 9. I'll try to keep it 9. And Rob says, if there's something more scary, it's the speed at which government, in conjunction with big tech, to shut anyone down. That form of fascism is really terrifying. And Steve says, sedition, if I were a wealthy man. Dia Swift says, good night. I admit the power of Google and Facebook and Twitter is terrifying. So you know what? We got to break them up. But that means that power should not, that does not mean that power should not have been used to shut down Donald Trump, okay, and the Proud Boys, okay, and the Boogaloo Boys right now. Those are two separate issues. Steve says, sedition if I were a wealthy man. Dia says, good night. Sandy says, good night. Thank you. Lana says, good night all. Dale Weaver says, good night all. Keep fighting. Don't you worry. I will. See you tomorrow.